"Take my bread," whispered the little girl. No one could believe what the tribe did next. The town of Despair's Fork was a skeleton drying in the sun. A desolate place, it reeked of starvation, raw fear, and a simmering, suffocating prejudice. 7-year-old Sarah, however, remained untouched by the town's rot. While men muttered curses and checked their rifles, she drew a lopsided flower in the dust with a stick, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her innocence was a defiant splash of color in a world of gray. Her mother's warnings about the Ute, the savages in the hills, were just noise. Sarah only knew the ache of her own empty stomach and the chilling silence where laughter used to be. The settlers blamed the tribe for every misfortune, a hatred that festered like a snakebite. They were a town just spoiling for a fight. Suddenly, the church bell shattered the stillness, its frantic clanging a scream of panic. A dust cloud boiled on the horizon. It wasn't the long-awaited supply wagon. It was something else. A reckoning was coming to Despair's Fork, and what one little girl holding the town's last piece of bread did next would change the West forever. Before this story continues, tell me in the comments, in a world driven by hunger and hate, is a single act of kindness more powerful than a loaded gun? I want to read your thoughts below. The town of Despair's Fork was a carcass picked clean by the sun. It lay gasping in a valley of cracked earth and brittle gray sagebrush, its name a bitter truth on the tongues of the settlers who were pinned there. The sky was not blue. It was a merciless white-hot sheet of brass that offered no hope of rain, only the promise of more dust. Dust on the windowsills. Dust in the water barrels. Dust in the lungs of every man, woman, and child. It was the taste of failure. In the center of the town's only street, a splash of impossible color moved against the monochrome despair. 7-year-old Sarah knelt oblivious to the heat shimmering off the ground. With a broken piece of slate, she etched a lopsided flower into the dirt, her brow furrowed in a state of profound concentration. A sharp voice cut through the air. "Sarah, get out of that filth." Her mother, Martha, stood on the porch of their cabin, her face a taut mask of weariness. A strand of pale hair had escaped her bun, clinging to her damp forehead. "You'll catch a lung fever playing in the dirt." "But I'm making a garden," Mama Sarah said, not looking up. She gave her flower a looping stem and 2 sad, drooping leaves. Martha's shoulders slumped. "There are no gardens here, child. Not anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of dead crops and dying hope. Inside the cabin was a cave of shadows and quiet desperation. The last of the flour, a meager handful, sat in a wooden bowl. Martha worked it with practiced angry hands, kneading and punching as if trying to beat life back into their world. The smell of baking bread, once a scent of comfort and home, now smelled only of endings. She placed the small precious loaf on the table. It was barely enough for 2 real meals. "You listen to me," Sarah Martha said, her voice low and fierce. She broke off a piece and wrapped it in a clean rag, pressing it into her daughter's hands. "This has to last. You do not eat it all at once. You do not show it to anyone. You understand me. This is all there is." Sarah nodded, clutching the warm cloth-wrapped treasure. It felt heavier than any stone she had ever collected. "And you stay close." Martha's voice dropped to a harsh whisper, her eyes flicking toward the dark line of the mountains on the horizon. "The Ute are hungry too, and they are not like us. They are bad medicine." Sarah didn't understand the venom in her mother's voice. She had seen them once, a few men on horseback watching the town from a distant ridge. They didn't look like monsters. They just looked quiet. Later, as the sun began its slow, bleeding descent, she saw men gathered by the saloon. Their voices were low, but their anger was a palpable thing. She heard the Reverend's name invoked like a prayer and a curse. Reverend Blackwood says it's a test of our faith, one man rasped, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Faith don't fill a man's belly, another shot back. The Reverend says they pray to devils on that mountain cursin' our land. That's what this is. A curse. A third man, his face gaunt and his eyes burning with a hollow fire, leaned in close. And I say it's high time we taught those heathens a lesson about whose God is stronger. The threat hung in the thick, still air, a promise of violence waiting for an excuse. Sarah, watching from her porch, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the coming evening. She didn't know what a heathen was, but she knew the sound of a word that was meant to hurt. The excuse arrived on a half-dead horse. A lone rider, a boy from an outlying homestead, galloped into town, his face pale with terror. He nearly fell from the saddle, gasping for air. "They're coming." He choked out his words, swallowed by a fit of coughing. "A war party, maybe 20 strong. I saw them on the ridge. They're coming this way." A terrible silence fell over the street. The men froze, their angry debate forgotten. A woman gasped. For a single heart-stopping moment, the entire town held its breath. Then came the sound. Clang. A single piercing ring from the lookout bell beside the church. A pause filled with a universe of dread. Clang, 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 clang. The bell screamed a frantic hammering cry of pure panic. Every head turned to the east. A dust cloud was boiling on the horizon, a dirty brown smudge against the bruised purple sky. It was too focused, too fast for a supply wagon. It moved with the grim, relentless purpose of a closing fist. It was them. A reckoning was coming to Despair's Fork, and the last bit of bread in town was clutched in the small, unknowing hands of a child. The bell was a hammer, and the sky was an anvil, and the town of Despair's Fork was caught between them. Panic was a wildfire. It leaped from porch to porch, its heat sending people scurrying like ants from a burning log. Doors slammed. Men with grim, set jaws dragged long rifles from beneath dusty beds. Inside. Get the children inside. The order was a ragged chorus shouted by fathers who had forgotten the sound of their own laughter. Martha grabbed Sarah's arm, her grip a bloodless claw. "Hurry, Sarah, to the church." "Now, but who is it?" Mama Sarah asked, her small legs struggling to keep up as she was pulled through the swirling dust. "The devil is coming, child." Martha rasped, her eyes wide with a terror Sarah had never seen before. "And we will meet him with God on our side." The church was a prison of smells. It stank of unwashed bodies of fear, sweat of old wood, and the cloying sweetness of lamp oil. The townsfolk were crammed into the pews, their faces pale and upturned in the gloom. A baby wailed a thin, terrified sound that was quickly muffled against its mother's breast. At the pulpit, Reverend Blackwood stood, his tall, skeletal frame a dark silhouette against the stained glass window. He was not shouting. His voice was a low fire, a crackling flame of righteous certainty that licked at the edges of their fear. "They are the serpent in our garden." The Reverend hissed, his hands gripping the edges of the pulpit. "Sent by the great tempter to test our resolve, they have poisoned our lands with their heathen prayers, and now they come to poison our very souls." He paused, letting the fear marinate in the hot, still air. "But the Lord provides his flock with the strength to cast out the serpent. He places iron in our hands and fire in our hearts." Sarah huddled on the floor near the back, the small cloth-wrapped piece of bread clutched to her chest. The Reverend's words were just thunder, loud and frightening, but without meaning. She didn't see a serpent. She only saw the frightened faces around her. In the chaos, no one was watching the small girl who had crept to the heavy oak door. She found a crack, a sliver of light in the suffocating darkness, and pressed her eye to it. And she saw them. They were not a tide of screaming demons. They were a line of tall figures on horseback, as still and silent as the red rock canyons that guarded the valley. The setting sun caught the beads on their buckskin shirts, making them glitter like fallen stars. Their faces, framed by long black hair, were not twisted with hate. They were masks of profound sorrow. The man at the front, the one with an eagle feather tied in his hair, had the saddest eyes Sarah had ever seen. He raised a hand. The warriors stopped. 100 yards of dust separated two kinds of hunger, one for food, one for blood. A tense, terrible silence fell over the world, broken only by the low whistle of the wind. A man near the church door cocked his rifle, the sound a sharp, definitive click in the stillness. A promise. Sarah could feel the whole town holding its breath, a coiled snake ready to strike. Was this what her mother meant? Was this the devil? Through her peephole, Sarah saw the Reverend step out onto the church porch. The last rays of sun glinted off the silver cross around his neck. He did not hold a Bible. He held his hands out to the sides as if embracing the violence to come. He took a deep breath, his mouth opening to shout the words that would unleash hell upon the world. But the first sound was not his voice. It was not a gunshot. It was the soft, almost imperceptible click of a small wooden latch. Unseen, Sarah had slipped the bar on the church door. Before her mother could turn, before the men could aim, before the Reverend could utter his command, she was outside. A small pale figure in a world of brown dust and long, violent shadows. She did not run. She did not scream. She simply began to walk, her small feet kicking up little puffs of dust straight into the space between the guns and the lances, straight into the heart of the hatred. And in her hand, she held out her small, precious, cloth-wrapped offering. Time broke. It did not shatter into chaos. It slowed to the thick, syrupy pace of a bad dream. On the church porch, the Reverend's mouth hung open, his righteous command dying in his throat. A collective gasp, like the last breath of a dying man, shuddered through the gathered townsfolk. Martha's hand flew to her own mouth, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. Her daughter, her Sarah, walking toward the painted devils, 100 yards of sun-hardened earth. That was the distance. A lifetime. To Sarah, it was just a walk. The ground was warm beneath the thin soles of her shoes. The setting sun was gentle on her face. The men on horseback ahead were no longer a frightening monolithic wall. As she drew closer, she could see the details. The weariness in their posture. The dust caked on their leather leggings. The stray gray hair in the braid of one warrior. They were just men. She stopped before the leader, the man with the eagle feather and the sad eyes. His horse was a mountain of dark muscle and steam, its large liquid eye regarding her with a calm curiosity. The man himself was even more immense, a figure carved from rock and sky, his shadow swallowing her whole. For a long silent moment, the world was nothing but the sound of Sarah's own small heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. A bead of sweat traced a path down a settler's temple. A finger tightened on a trigger, and then the mountain moved. The chief swung his leg over his horse, sliding to the ground in a single fluid motion. His feet made no sound on the hard-packed earth. He was taller still on the ground, a giant of a man whose presence seemed to bend the very light around him. The town watched, paralyzed. They expected a lunge, a snatch, a final brutal act. Instead, he knelt. The motion was slow, deliberate, and utterly world-shattering. A war chief did not kneel. Not to a governor, not to a general, and certainly not to a small pale-faced child from a town of enemies. A wave of disbelief rippled through the settlers. The warrior beside the chief flinched, his own eyes wide with shock. Sarah did not see the political impossibility of the act. She only saw that the man's sad eyes were now level with her own. He was no longer a giant. He was just a man. She took the final step and held out her hand. "I have bread," she said, her voice small but clear in the vast waiting silence. "Mama said it's the last, but you look hungry too." He did not speak. His gaze dropped from her eyes to the small cloth-wrapped bundle. His own hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of war and survival, came forward. He did not take the offering. He received it. He cupped her small hand in both of his, holding the warm bundle as if it were a living bird, fragile and precious, its pulse, the last heartbeat of a dying world. He held it for a moment, his eyes closed as if listening to it. Then, with a tenderness that defied everything, the settlers believed, he carefully unwrapped the cloth. He took the piece of bread, broke it cleanly in two. But he did not eat. He held one half up to the fading light of the sky, a silent acknowledgment to the Great Spirit. He then touched it to his own heart, a gesture of profound meaning. The other half he carefully rewrapped in the cloth and tucked deep inside his leather medicine pouch. It was not food. It was a sign, a sacrament, an answer to a question the town hadn't even known he was asking. The tension, the raw, murderous pressure that had been building for hours did not simply break. It evaporated. It turned to a fine mist of confusion and awe. Rifles were lowered not in surrender but in sheer, dumbfounded bewilderment. "What in God's name?" a man whispered from the church steps. "It's a trick," another muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Some kind of witchery." The chief stood his full height, once again commanding the space. He turned his solemn gaze from Sarah to the stunned crowd of settlers. He opened his mouth, and a voice deep and resonant as rolling thunder spoke the words of his people, flowing into the evening air. The language was strange, guttural, yet held no malice. It sounded like a prayer. As he finished, the warrior beside him, the one who had flinched, stepped forward. His face was a mask of reverence. He faced the town, took a deep breath, and prepared to translate. He prepared to deliver a message that was either a death sentence or something far, far stranger. And the entire town of Despair's Fork waited for the axe to fall. The silence was a razor's edge. Every soul in Despair's Fork was balanced upon it, waiting for the translator's words to cut one way or the other. The warrior, whose name was Wolf's Shadow, seemed to feel the weight of all those staring, hoping, hating eyes. He looked first at his chief, then at the small girl who stood unafraid beside him, and finally at the pale, frightened faces of the town. He took a breath. "My chief eagle eye of the Ute does not come for war." The words, spoken in clear, unaccented English, fell into the silence like stones into a deep well. The ripples they created were not of relief, but of profound confusion. Rifles that had been half lowered now drooped fully, their muzzles pointing at the dust. Miller, the town's pragmatic blacksmith and unofficial leader, took a half-step forward, his face a mask of disbelief. Wolf's Shadow continued, his voice steady and solemn, a storyteller reciting a sacred text. "Our seer, a woman whose eyes can see the threads of winter before the first snow falls, had a vision. She saw a season of great hunger, a sky of iron, a land of bone. She saw our children with hollow bellies and our warriors too weak to draw their bows." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the gaunt faces of the settlers. "She saw your children, too, dying under the same empty sky." A sob broke from a woman in the crowd. Martha pulled Sarah closer, her embrace now a desperate protective shield. Sarah didn't understand all the words, but she felt their power. She felt the sadness that flowed from the warrior's voice, a current that connected his people's suffering to her own. But the Great Spirit gave our seer another vision. Wolf's Shadow said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing them all in. "Hope was not in our lances or your long guns. Hope was in a gift that must be given without question from a heart that holds no hate." The seer said our survival depended on finding the purest heart among the pale faces, and receiving from that heart an offering of life from a dying world. His dark eyes found Sarah. The bread was not a meal, it was the sign. The child was the fulfillment of the vision. The truth settled over the town, not with a crash, but with a slow, crushing weight. It was a truth of their own ugliness. They had stood ready to slaughter men who were on a spiritual quest, men whose faith was now inextricably tied to the innocence of one of their own children. Shame, hot and potent, washed over them. It was visible in the sudden downturn of mouths, the lowering of eyes that could no longer meet the steady gaze of the Ute warriors. Reverend Blackwood stumbled back a step, his face ashen. The serpent he had preached about was not on the mountain. It had been coiled in his own pulpit, its venom the words of his own making. Miller finally found his voice a rough, cracked thing. A sign. A sign for what? If you are starving as we are, what good is a sign? It was the question everyone was thinking. A desperate, practical question in the face of a terrifying, mystical revelation. The vision did not promise salvation, only for the Ute wolf's shadow explained a new urgency in his tone. The seer spoke of two peoples. She said the gift would not save one. It would unlock the path to save all. A new kind of standoff was born, not of aggression, but of a shared, terrifying vulnerability. Two leaders, Miller and Chief Eagle Eye, stood across from each other, no longer enemies, but two fathers bearing the impossible weight of their starving people. They were equals in their desperation. What path Miller pressed, taking another step forward, his hands now open and empty at his sides. For God's sake, man, if you know a way, tell us. Where does this sign? Lead Chief Eagle Eye did not speak. The time for words was over. He turned his body a silent, commanding presence against the dying sun and raised his arm. He did not point to the east, where the supply wagons were supposed to come. He did not point to the west, toward the empty plains. He pointed straight up toward the dark, jagged peaks of the mountains that loomed over the valley. A place the settlers saw as nothing but barren rock and shadow. Wolf's shadow's voice was quiet now, but it carried across the dust with a strange new power. He says the way to survive is not on this dying land. It is up there. He paused, letting the impossible promise hang in the air. And now, he will show you. The chief's arm pointing toward the unforgiving mountains was a silent command that fractured the fragile unity of the town. It's a trap. Reverend Blackwood's voice was a ragged tear in the stunned silence. He'll lead our men into the rocks and slaughter them. Has this child's trickery blinded you all? But the fear of the Ute was now overshadowed by a greater fear: starvation. Miller the blacksmith, his face grimed with soot and worry, stepped forward, his voice a low rumble of iron. Reverend, my daughter hasn't eaten a full meal in 3 days. Your God hasn't sent us rain. This man, this chief, is offering something more than prayer. He turned to face the townsman. I'm going. I'd rather die on my feet following a sliver of hope than on my knees in the dust. Sarah's father, a quiet farmer named Thomas, was the next to step forward. He looked at his daughter, who was now safely in her mother's arms, and a new resolve hardened his face. His child had opened a door. He would be damned if he was too cowardly to walk through it. I'm going with him. One by one, 5 other men joined them, a small, desperate band formed not of courage but of the absolute absence of any other choice. The journey was a pilgrimage into hell. The foothills gave way to steep, treacherous slopes of scree and shattered rock. The settlers, with their worn leather boots, slipped and slid, their breath coming in ragged, painful gasps in the thin air. The sun was a relentless hammer. The Ute moved like water flowing over stone. They were ghosts in the rocks, their moccasins finding silent purchase on paths that did not exist. They did not mock the struggling settlers. Instead, a new, unspoken dynamic emerged. When Thomas lost his footing, a hand shot out and gripped his arm, steadying him. It was Wolf's shadow. He didn't speak, but his eyes held a flicker of shared understanding. 2 men, 2 fathers on a fool's errand for their children. Later, Wolf's shadow offered his own water skin. Thomas drank the water tasting of leather and a strange new kind of trust. Prejudice, he realized, was a luxury for men with full bellies and solid ground beneath their feet. Here, on the ragged edge of the world, there was only survival. After hours that felt like years, Chief Eagle Eye led them to a sheer cliff face, a dead end of granite and shadow. Despair, cold and bitter, washed over the settlers. "This is it," Miller demanded, his voice cracking with exhaustion and betrayal. "You led us all this way to die at a rock wall." The chief simply raised a hand for silence. He walked to a section of the cliff that was veiled by a thick curtain of ancient petrified vines, as gray and hard as the rock itself. He pushed them aside. A dark, narrow fissure was revealed, a crack in the world just wide enough for a single man to pass through. An unnatural coolness, smelling of damp earth and living things, flowed out of it. It was a tomb's entrance, or a miracle's doorway. With a final searching look at Miller, the chief stepped through and vanished. One by one, the settlers followed, their hearts pounding with a mixture of terror and a wild, irrational hope. They stepped out of the darkness and into the first day of creation. They were in a hidden canyon, a world sealed off from the dying valley below. A gentle, impossible stream of the clearest water they had ever seen tumbled over moss-covered rocks, pooling in a deep, serene basin. The air was cool and sweet. Lush ferns grew in the shadows, and tiny, resilient wildflowers, blue and yellow and white, poked out from crevices in the rock, a riot of color in a world they had thought was only brown and gray. It was a sanctuary. But they were not alone. Near the spring, a small group of Ute women and children were gathered. They were not idle. They moved with a quiet purpose, using sharpened sticks to dig in the soft, dark earth near the water's edge. As the men watched, an old woman pulled a lumpy, dark-skinned tuber from the ground. Another was roasting them over a small, smokeless fire, and the air was filled with a scent like sweet baking earth. This was no trap. This was a home. The entire tribe had placed their faith in this hidden place and in the vision that had led them to share it. The old woman looked up and saw them. She did not startle. Her face, a beautiful roadmap of wrinkles, broke into a small, gentle smile. She walked toward them, holding out a single steaming root. She offered it to Miller. He looked at the strange food, then at the chief, then back to the woman's kind, waiting eyes. He took it. He bit into it. His own eyes widened. It was earthy, sweet, and more satisfying than any bread he had ever tasted. It was the taste of life itself. The Ute women showed them how to dig, how to find the fat, life-giving roots. They shared their food freely, a silent, powerful communion that washed away the last dregs of hatred and fear. The settlers and the Ute ate together, their hunger finally sated, a quiet laughter beginning to echo in the hidden canyon. Hope was no longer a sliver. It was a sun. It was in that moment of peace, as Thomas leaned back against a rock, full and overwhelmed with gratitude, that a sharp cry came from above. A young Ute boy perched high on the canyon rim, as a lookout was on his feet, pointing frantically back toward the plains. Every man scrambled up, following his gaze. The hope in their bellies turned to ice. On the far horizon, a storm was coming. But it was not a storm of rain. It was a roiling, churning wall of brown dust, a monster that was eating the sky. It moved with an unnatural speed, a suffocating wave of earth and wind aimed directly at the small, vulnerable town they had left behind. Their families were alone, exposed, and directly in its path. The peace of the hidden canyon was a dream shattered. On the horizon, the dust storm was a physical manifestation of God's wrath, a roiling brown wall that was actively devouring the sky. The feast was over. A new hunger was coming, the hunger of the wind. Chief Eagle Eye and Miller exchanged a single stark look. There was no question, no debate. The animosity between their peoples had been a fragile, man-made thing. This was elemental, a force that did not distinguish between red skin and white. "We must go back," Miller yelled over the rising wind. Now the descent was a frantic, controlled fall. The caution of their climb was gone, replaced by a desperate, shared urgency. Down the treacherous slopes they scrambled a river of men against a tide of oncoming destruction. Where a settler slipped, a Ute hand grabbed. When a path was blocked, a warrior pointed a new way, their knowledge of the mountain a living map. They were no longer two peoples. They were one tribe united by a single purpose to get home. They carried sacks of the life-giving roots and water skins filled from the hidden spring, their only weapons against the coming apocalypse. Back in Despair's Fork, the world was ending. The sun vanished, blotted out by a sickly yellow-brown gloom. The wind began to shriek a high, thin scream that ripped at the shingles of the cabins and tore the hope from people's hearts. Martha held Sarah in a death grip inside their small home, the walls groaning around them. "Pray, Sarah," she cried. "Pray to God to save us." But Sarah wasn't praying. She was listening. Through the howl of the wind, she thought she could hear the echo of the chief's song, a low, resonant hum of the earth itself. It was Reverend Blackwood who emerged into the gale. He stumbled toward the church, his face no longer filled with fire, but with a terrible, profound humility. He rang the bell not as an alarm, but as a summons, a call for sanctuary. People poured from their homes, battling the wind to reach the holy house. The last to arrive were the Ute women and children who had been waiting at the edge of town. They hesitated at the church door, the symbol of their persecution. Martha, holding Sarah's hand, saw their hesitation. She looked at the face of a Ute mother, saw the same terror that was in her own heart, and did the unthinkable. She reached out her free hand. "Come," she said, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "There is room." Just as the first wave of the storm hit a blinding wall of sand and fury, the men arrived. They burst through the church doors, Miller and the chief at the front, and slammed the heavy oak bar into place, just as the world outside dissolved into a screaming black chaos. Inside, there was a strange and holy peace. The monster raged outside, but within the house of God, two peoples huddled together in the flickering lamplight. The air was thick with the scent of fear, but also of something new: respect. They were all just souls seeking shelter from the storm. And they did not go hungry. The Ute shared the roasted roots. The settlers shared the last of their own water. A Ute mother gave a piece of the sweet, earthy food to one of the settlers' crying babies, and the child instantly grew quiet. Sarah found herself sitting beside a Ute boy about her age with curious dark eyes. His name was Little Fox. They didn't share a language, but when Sarah offered him a piece of her root, he broke his own in half and offered it back. They smiled. It was a language everyone understood. In the center of the church, Chief Eagle Eye and Miller sat side by side, their silence a testament to a bond forged in desperation and sealed in shared survival. The storm raged for a day and a night. When it finally passed, the dawn broke on a changed world. The sky was a pale, hazy blue, and a thick layer of brown dust coated everything, softening the hard edges of the town. When the great door of the church was opened, the two people stepped out into the new morning, blinking in the strange light. They were not the same people who had entered. In the weeks that followed, Despair's Fork was reborn. The men, guided by the Ute, piped water down from the hidden spring, and soon the town well flowed freely for the first time in a year. They planted a shared garden on the creek's edge, the settlers' seeds in the Ute's sacred earth. When the supply wagon finally did arrive, its driver staring in disbelief at the peaceful mingling of the two groups, Miller traded half the goods, tools, cloth, and medicine to the chief for a promise of shared knowledge of the land. A pact was made not on paper, but with a handshake between two men who had seen the world end and had chosen to build a new one together. One bright morning, 3 months later, Miller took a can of white paint and a brush to the old weathered sign at the edge of town. With Chief Eagle Eye and a crowd of settlers and Ute watching, he slowly, deliberately painted over the words, "Despair's Fork." Then he turned to Sarah, who stood beside him. "What shall we call it, little one?" he asked, his voice soft. "You started all this." Sarah looked at the kind face of the chief, at her new friend Little Fox, and at the green shoots rising from their shared garden. Hope, she whispered. Just hope. And so Miller painted. Letter by letter, he wrote the new name. Sarah's Hope. The final shot is of the two children, Sarah and Little Fox, chasing a butterfly through the garden, their laughter echoing in the clean, quiet air, the first true sound of peace the valley had ever known.